Hi, everybody. It's so good to be speaking to all of you today over your lunch break. I hope you have something to eat while I go through my slides. I always find my bio to be a bit more, gives me a lot more emphasis on what I need to speak than I can deliver. So I hope that the discussion can touch on some of my previous experiences and my most recent one at the forum, being a PhD student under Dr. John Davis. I want to share with you something that I'm really excited to talk about, which is the accumulation of my work for the past 4 years on supporting the use of research evidence to inform decision making in crisis zones. And feel free that throughout my presentation, if you feel you have a burning question you would like to ask, throw it in the chat box. I'll keep a note of it and then I'll try to address it either through my presentation or I want to really open this up to more of a lively discussion afterwards, which is usually where I shine. So bear with me while I go through my slides. What I wanted to talk about today is something really very close to my heart, which is this idea of how can we make sure that research evidence gets in the hand of the decision makers in crisis zones in real time. And the reason why I bring this up is because thinking back to a time in your life when you're trying to make a decision, whether it's buying a house, buying a new car, and being having access to so much different types of information at your disposal to make that decision, and then seeking the best available one to make the decision in real time. That is really the impetus behind my work. So what I wanted to do today is talk to you a little bit about how do we make sure that evidence-informed decision making is not simply a process of providing more research evidence, but rather, on the contrary, it's finding ways to support the use of what already exists. One of my biggest insights from my work for the past 4 years is that when it comes to humanitarian aid interventions in crisis zones, there's actually ample amount of evidence that is available. The problem lies that that available evidence is not being used, or that we don't actually have in place strategies to support its use to its best capacity. Early on, it was very important that we define what research evidence is because we found that over when we interviewed so many decision makers from around the world who work in crisis zones, many of them had very alternative viewpoints or definitions of what research evidence is. So for me, and the research evidence is the output of research that's been conducted in a systematic way and reported in a transparent manner. Now, we distinguish such research evidence from other types of information that may include data ordinary knowledge, and stakeholders' opinion. That is not to say, though, that these other types of information are not equally important when making decisions in crisis zones, but the focus of my work has been on the first type of information, which is research evidence. So one of the key insights that we found out was that when it comes to gaps in relation to this area about supporting the use of evidence in crisis zones, there's actually been very little work that's been done on the fulsome array of strategies to support evidence use in crisis zones, both within and beyond the health and humanitarian aid systems. So when we look at the existing literature around this topic, we find that most often when people talk about strategies to support evidence use, they're really only focusing on those two key systems, the research and humanitarian aid system, with very little focus into the political system, for example, or the health system, which we believe play a very important interplay when supporting evidence use in crisis zones. So for my first study, I wanted to step back and do a macro level analysis where I developed a conceptual framework that really gets at outlining the strategies and the facilitators of and barriers to research evidence in crisis zones, specifically LMIICs. And the reason why I wanted to focus on low and middle income countries is because that is where most crises do occur and where my hope is that my work will have the biggest impact. In terms of our third insight, we also found out that one of the key gaps is that we know very little about the factors that influence the use of research evidence in policy development in humanitarian crises. We know that evidence is used, but we don't know what actually helps it to be used or what stops in its way. And so for my second study, I wanted to examine all the factors that influence the use of research evidence in the governmental health policy development process for a specific crisis. And in this case, it was the Syrian refugee crisis in both Lebanon and Ontario. And we chose those two contexts because that's where ones where the crisis has played a big factor or had a big impact on those two host communities, but also is because we had established key networks in the field that will help us access those key stakeholders that will help us identify the factors. And for the key gap, which is our insight number four, we found that there was very little research done on the experiences of decision makers in crisis zones and evidence websites. So, I hope that by now you're getting sort of an understanding that I went very macro level, looking at the system level, but really tried to get narrowed down to a more specific level, which is here. We know that evidence websites do exist. We know that there are one, for example, in this case, Evidence Aid, which is the only evidence website that has been created that provides systematic reviews on the effectiveness of interventions and summary of systematic reviews on the effectiveness of interventions in humanitarian aid. But yet, there's been very little work that has been done on understanding how do decision makers in crisis zones find this website? Is it addressing their knowledge needs? And if not, what are some ways that we can put forward specific suggestions to improve evidence aid website that other websites, other evidence websites, such as our own health systems evidence, can use to improve evidence used by decision makers. So back to my study one, which is for one of the key insights out of this work was that we need this conceptual framework that really outlines the strategies to support evidence use at different system level. But also we took it one step further by actually putting forward strategies at a specific actor. So when we look here's a visual simulation of the four systems: the political, the health research, and the international humanitarian aid system. And within each one of those systems, as you could tell from this conceptual framework, we outlined the barriers and the facilitators the evidence use, but we took it one step further by putting forward strategies that are grounded within the research evidence, as within the literature itself, and in some cases, more of an interpretive approach, which is what the methodology we chose in this case was a critical interpretive synthesis allows us to do, which is to sample literature beyond it allows us to sample gray literature and any other policy documents that can help us to fill in this conceptual gap of what are those strategies that can support the barriers and facilitators we identified. Now, in terms of contributions on the first study, some of the big insights that came out is that this conceptual framework in the study that I created was the first one to generate a new framework at the different system level. And I'll share this with you. I have presented this framework at multiple conferences, and there's been huge interest by humanitarian aid organizations, Red Cross being one of them, of looking into taking this framework and actually implementing it in the field. So right now, I am in conversations with the Canadian Red Cross to see which site, which crisis we're gonna field trial this framework in. And so I do know that it is resonating in the humanitarian aid field. Substantively, the framework does provide insights that different actors, so whether you are a policymaker in the political level, in the political system, or you're a health system leader in the health system level, or you're a humanitarian aid worker in the humanitarian aid system, can use to reflect on how best to support evidence use. And methodologically, in terms of research methods, this is really the first time a critical interpretive synthesis, which is a relatively new method. It's like a systematic review, but allows more of an interpretive approach to it, is applied to an area that has not really done this kind of work before. For our second study, I wanted to take some of those strategies and the barriers and facilities that I identified in the big conceptual framework, and I wanted to dig deeper. So in this case, I looked at the political system itself. I wanted to sample a specific crisis. In this case, it was the Syrian refugee crisis. So I studied it both in Ontario and Lebanon and looked at the governmental health policy development process for two specific key policies that were targeted to address the health needs of Syrian refugees. I did that by doing a embedded case study design, examining those two policy decisions by interviewing all the stakeholders that were involved in the development of the policies. And what resulted is this idea that research evidence was actually not the main determining factor that influenced the policy development process for both Lebanon and Ontario. What I found out was that there was four other broad factors that really helped to explain how the policies came about. Some of those factors included the fact there was no veto points, there was alignment between the federal and provincial Ontario towards the A, accepting the Syrian refugees into Canada, but also B, into propelling the policy development process forward because of this alignment between both provincial and federal governments. There was also this idea of key engagement with the societal actors. I saw this play out very well in Lebanon. All the key stakeholders that were involved in the addressing the health needs of Syrian refugees were invited to be part of a National Health Steering Committee, which really made sure that everybody's voice was sort of heard and accounted for in the policies, but also it allowed for the buy-in from all the stakeholders to allow the policy to develop in a much faster time frame. The both policies in London and sorry in Ontario and in Lebanon really spoke the embedded values of security and inclusion, which helped align the policies and propel it forward. And finally, the idea of external factors. So the example I like to give here is the image of Alan Kurdi, which is the Syrian child that capitalized all over the new media coverage and really helped the Liberal government at the time to use it as a way to campaign for welcoming Syrian refugees in Canada, but also to get everybody in line towards figuring out how to address their health needs. But a key insight out of the study is that we need to find better ways to make sure that research evidence is used. We know from this study that research evidence was not the main determining factor. So then it begs the question as, well, how can we better put forward strategies to support that evidence used by decision makers? And that's precisely what I tried to do in my final study, where I actually looked at an existing tool like Evidence Aid, and I wanted to know, well, why was such a tool not used by decision makers when they were trying to develop the health policies for Syrian refugees, for example? And using a specific framework that tries to get at the different facets of why people use websites and how better to enhance their use, I found out that Evidence Aid was useful, it was accessible, and was credible. People really liked the way that the website provided all the systematic reviews on specific issues in relation to humanitarian aid. But yet there were still problems that were, I think, in my opinion, are extremely important. And one of the reasons why we still struggle in making sure that evidence use gets in the hands of decision makers. And some of those problems include the lack of a search engine on the home page. So the way I like to think of it is I'm an avid Google user, and I love that when I go on google.ca or google.com, it pulls up a very simple search bar that I can put what I'm looking for, and the answers is right there. I don't have to click on multiple tabs. I think that's extremely important, and that's what decision makers want, especially if they're working in a crisis zones in real time. So think of an earthquake or a tsunami where you don't have ample amount of time to go through multiple tabs. But also that's a lot of the full length articles were linked to a site requiring a payment. I mean, we see this over and over again. We need to find better ways to provide evidence that is open access and free for people to use it. Most of my decision makers that I spoke to that were able to access the full text articles did so because they already had university credentials, university library credentials that they can use. What I think one of the key insights out of that study is that I was able to put forward sort of 7 specific suggestions about how to improve evidence aid. Many of those suggestions can be used by other evidence websites that are trying to get at exactly this, which is providing ways to support evidence use for decision makers across the board. One of the last things I want to talk about in terms of study 3 is that user testing as a methodology was always used in sort of product design, but this was the first time that it was used to focus on evidence website. I think that's very important because it can provide a lot of insight for other researchers who are trying to evaluate evidence websites that are trying to get at what the target users want and need. Finally, my thesis work, the 3 studies, as I said earlier, the framework I think is extremely important because it provided this conceptual overview at a system level, and it allowed me to dig deeper in my second study at the factors that influence evidence use in a policy development for a crisis, and finally to take a very particular view on a specific knowledge translation tool for crisis zones. The strength is that all 3 studies really build on each other. I use strategically selected political and health systems theoretical frameworks to ground my analysis, and I use a range of qualitative methods to address novel research questions that haven't been answered in the past. In terms of limitations, like any other work, I was unable to really make assertions on how context can influence the applications of strategies. And what I mean by that is that it's very easy for me to say, we should convene a stakeholder dialogue for a protracted crisis like the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon, where all stakeholders get invited into a room and we get to deliberate about the best policy options to address the health issue. Plays out very differently if you're dealing with an earthquake, where you don't have time and resources to really be able to put forward a stakeholder dialogue. There was also considerable variety in the availability of data within each individual study. I faced some difficulty in Ontario in trying to secure interviews with key stakeholders in the Ministry of Health because of the time at the time there was a change of government. And I think that that insight is actually extremely important and should be considered. In terms of implications for policy, I think that in the political health and international humanitarian aid system, there really needs to be a stated strategic direction that would mandate that research evidence is explicitly considered in decision making. I looked into examples where that was done. For example, in India, the Ministry of Health now has a research to evidence sort of a unit that mandates that every single policy document that comes out of the Ministry of Health, research evidence must be accounted for as one input into the development of policy. They're not saying that all of them need to have that, but at least that research evidence needs to be accounted for as one input into informing that policy. And in the health research system, we also need a strategic directions that would mandate that research initiatives support evidence-informed decision making. And what I mean by that is that we really need to put more emphasis on academic institutions that are generating the research evidence to work collaboratively with the international humanitarian aid system to make sure that their research questions are being answered and vice versa, and that we can work together on a collaborative model. And for the international humanitarian aid system, I really think that what needs to be done is that we need to emphasize that we're not saying that professional judgment should not be considered, but rather that research evidence needs to be considered alongside professional judgment. And that's one of the big things that came out of this work, which is, I think, is an essential key insight, is that often at the beginning people argued or researchers argued that research evidence needs to replace a professional judgment, and that's not what I argue. And actually, on the contrary, what I say is that professional judgment is valid and extremely important in humanitarian aid because most often, sometimes we don't have the research evidence to address a key insight that professional judgment is better suited to answer. What I'm arguing is that we should always be looking at the research evidence and finding ways to use it in the best way possible to support our decisions. I already touched about this earlier when I said that I've been lucky and fortunate since presenting my work that major humanitarian aid organizations are looking to operationalize the strategies to support evidence use. But what we also need in terms of future research is to look at what type of influence each mechanism could be expected to have if we manage to successfully implement it in different systems and for different types of crises. I want to thank you all today for joining me. I really tried very consciously to keep this at 20 minutes, and I can see that I'm at 19. So I urge you all, and you're all welcome to ask any questions you might have right now to open this up for a lively discussion. And for anybody else hearing this recording later, please feel free to reach out to me at my email, which is available on the McMaster Health Forum website. I am more than happy to engage this in discussion further afterwards. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Firas. That was a great presentation and a lot of content to get through in 20 minutes. So as you say, hopefully we'll get some good questions that come through the chat. Please feel free to ask any questions you have or share your comments in here. We do have one question, which is actually a very practical question for us. So one of the attendees was wondering whether you are able to share a copy of the framework and any of the relevant articles to your work.
Absolutely. So my second one, which is the governmental supporting the use of research evidence in the government health policy development for Syrian refugees, got published a month ago in Conflict and Health. I'm happy to share that. And also the third study is actually in press right now and should be out any day in health research systems and policy. And in terms of the framework, which is really what I was hoping to be the first one published, it's currently under review at Health Research Systems and Policy, and I'll share it the minute it's available. And if you follow me on Twitter or the McMaster Health Forum website, you will see that we will continuously tweet them as they become available. But my entire thesis where the framework is available is published online. And I will definitely share that. If you provide me with the email address, I'm more than happy to link you up with where it is, for sure.
Thanks, Firas. So if anybody is interested in receiving one or multiple of those publications and research, if you want to email us at forum@mcmaster.ca, forum@mcmaster.ca, then we can connect you with Firas and he can provide you with the content that you're interested in. We have another question for us. So first of all, they said thank you for a very useful talk, and then said or asked rather, would you recommend that research articles be translated into reports aimed at humanitarian stakeholders that summarize key findings?
Absolutely, and that's actually a great question. So one of the things that came out of my third study when I interviewed more than 31 decision makers from around the world who were currently or previously worked in a crisis zone was precisely that. They didn't want to read a systematic reviews, nor did they have the time or the skill set to understand the findings from a systematic review. They wanted a summary of the systematic review and put in a way that's actually easy to act on. And what they mean by that is that this idea came forward of a checklist. So everybody really wanted a checklist of what they can do in a specific to address a specific problem at a specific time. And evidence aid, to be honest, is trying to get at that. I think the feedback we got from all the decision makers we interviewed was the summary they're providing on their systematic reviews is just lacks an action list, sort of a one, two, three of how to go about implementing interventions, considerations they should be taking into account when implementing such interventions, etc.
Okay, great. Thanks for us. So if anybody else has other questions, please feel free to send them in. We have one more that's just come in here for us. It says, again, thanks for the great presentation. And then they ask whether your framework can be generalized to inform general health systems change and health systems guideline implementation in LMICs.
Wow, what a great question. I had a similar question at the Canadian Global Health Conference in Ottawa just a month ago. Somebody asked whether we could take this framework and apply it beyond crisis zones. And the answer is I potentially think yes. I haven't looked at it myself, and to be quite frank, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking how I can adapt it to other contexts and other settings. I've been so focused on crisis zones and trying to make a change in that arena that I haven't taken much time in thinking how it can be adapted elsewhere. I'm actually in the meantime now talking to my colleagues who do sort of similar work to say, hey, look at this framework, can you adapt it? And the feedback has been from them that absolutely, I can so see this being. Recently, somebody talked to me from Vancouver who works at a system level in Vancouver and said, I would love to implement this at my own sort of hospital network because I think there's a lot of those strategies can be adapted there. So yes, that is to answer your question. Sorry, I went on for so long because I'm thinking about it as I'm answering it. The answer, yes, I think it can. And I'm hoping that let me get through crisis zones of humanitarian aid first, and then I will look at other contexts. But if anybody else would like to take the framework and see if it can apply in their own context, please feel free, and I will happy to sort of collaborate with them to see how that works out. And that's part of the exciting work as us researchers when we do such things, is to see where it can go. And it's questions like yours that sort of make me think of new ways and future research towards my work. So please keep them coming.
Great. Thanks. We have another question here. It says, as someone who knows the research in this area, how translatable is the research across different crises and different jurisdictions?
Great question. So the reason why I say this is a great question because I struggled with that in my second year of doing this work and my 4 year of doing this, which is that I was trying to answer to myself, are all crises the same? And if not, how does my work change depending on the crisis? So what I ended up doing is actually a mapping exercise over more than a year period where I tried to map out all the crises around the world. How are they different? What are some common characteristics between them? And my short answer to you is my framework with the strategies does not apply to all contexts. It does need to account for the influence of different contexts, and that's part of actually why I'm working with the Canadian Red Cross to test it out in the field so that we can get to a point where the framework can have more contextual considerations. So, and what I mean by that is that can it be different when it applied in a earthquake or the tsunami as opposed to like what I said in my presentation, a protracted crisis like a refugee crisis? And the short answer is my most likely prediction is that yes, of course, it plays out differently, but that's why I put such a variety and diverse array of strategies, try to get as many of the crises that I was able to identify in my mapping exercise. I hope that answers your question.
That's great for us. Thanks. And actually, just a little bit to follow on that, when you were talking about doing your mapping exercise and, in terms of building out your framework, For sometimes the issues might be dealt with. If there's a crisis, it might be dealt with. Maybe there'd be a UN agency or something, a more global group that's leading that. Whereas in other cases, it might be a country-led initiative. Does that does that change much in terms of how the framework can be applied, or the use of evidence in that situation?
Yeah, that's a great comment, Steve. I think yes, but what we're seeing more and more in humanitarian aid is that there's a need for cross-sector collaboration. So it's now very unlikely that the UN system organizations or organizations like MSF would go into crisis zones and operate in a silo function. They will try to collaborate with other organizations as possible. Hence why strategies like stakeholder dialogues that are put forward are, and we've seen them done. It's not like I'm putting forward an idea that's never been done before. We saw them in Lebanon being very, very effective, led by the K2P Center, which is a knowledge to policy center in Lebanon, and really trying to get all the stakeholders, UN sector, domestic, like sort of local community level organizations, and political and health system level stakeholders on one table, trying to address the health needs of refugees. And the same can be applied when you go into I can't think of any crisis right now that really is one organization taking the lead on it. There most often will be consultation with other stakeholders, and hence why we need strategies that account for that. We need strategies to support evidence use that account for different stakeholders that are involved in addressing a crisis, not just one. And in the case that there is just one, which is again, we're moving in the humanitarian aid field, we're moving towards less of that. I did put forward this idea of a rapid response unit, which is a strategy that is designed to, if you are an organization working in a remote area in a very rapidly evolving crises and you need an answer to specific interventions, can we get you the evidence in a very short time through infrastructures that we already established somewhere away from that crisis? So the way to explain it, if you're in the middle of an Ebola crisis, you're trying to build a mobile health clinic, and you just need to know how can I best build that? What are the cost implementations involved with building that? What do I need to consider? Can you reach out to, for example, to a unit that's based in Geneva, Brussels, Canada, whatever the case is, and tell them, hey, this is my question. I need to answer this in the next, hour, 10 hours, 24 hours. And us researchers, people who are in the middle of academia and humanitarian aid, providing you with a list of the best available evidence to answer that specific question in a format that you can understand and act upon.
Great. Thanks, Ross. Yeah, I think that's a very important point that you make at the end, right? Is to be able to have that evidence in a format that can be understood and acted upon. I think that's
Exactly.
a key part of all of your discussions around the framework and the various ideas. So, if anybody else has any other questions, again, I'd encourage you to add them into the chat box. But we've had some really great questions so far, so clearly a lot of interest in this topic. And but before, just while we're waiting to see if there's any other questions that come in, Frost, did you have any other closing remarks or any other comments you'd like to share?
I'm very grateful for everybody for joining today. I can literally talk about this topic for the next 10 hours. So I try to be as much as possible succinct in my answers, and I apologize if I went on for a while, but please do feel free to reach out to me. I really genuinely mean that. I love talking about my work and how it can influence and change, hopefully, and have an impact on the humanitarian aid field and other sectors. So feel free to reach out to me at any point you have any comments or feedback about any of the work I presented today. Thank you all for joining.
Okay. Okay, great. So haven't seen any other questions come in yet. So again, just to reiterate, if you have any other questions for Firas that you think of at a later date, please email us at forum@mcmaster.ca. I'd be happy to put you in touch with Firas, and then he can answer your questions or share his research with you when it all becomes available. Again, I'd like to thank Firas for joining us here today and sharing his expertise on this topic, and certainly thank everybody for joining us here as well. We will be having more top 10 webinars in the new year. We have one scheduled for February that's up on our website right now, and there'll be more coming shortly. So please check in with our website there, and we hope that you'll join us for future top 10 webinars. Thanks again for us. Thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Have a great day.